There's an early chapter in South of Midnight where our protagonist Hazel is coming to grips with her newfound powers. It's an important tone setter because it's representative of what developer Compulsion Games is trying to do throughout a concise 12-hour runtime. Mythical creatures straight out of folklore from the American South drive a human story that stands as a fantastic example of how the local is universal, with the grand tapestry of that region's culture and history wrapped around an otherwise fairly straightforward action-adventure game. While there are aspects of South of Midnight that aren't necessarily groundbreaking, it's all uplifted by a clear and well-executed artistic vision that makes it one of the more memorable Xbox console exclusives of this generation.
My salvation.
A talking fish? Nope. Ain't no way.
Oh, Weaver like you must have seen stranger things than me.
Hazel has the ability to manipulate the magical threads of an ethereal realm. That's both the weapon she uses to defeat evil spirits and creatures, and the tool she relies on to piece together the tragic pasts of her neighbors and forebears in her hometown of Prospero. It's a fictional place roughly based on Louisiana, but one that's deeply rooted in the very real experience of the South. Traces of its dark history litter the dilapidated houses after a treacherous flood, contrasting with the remnants of communities that struggled to survive in those harsh conditions.
So I'm the last person left here.
These touches provide a rich context for South of Midnight, and it's working within it to unravel a larger story about the pain, guilt, and trauma many of us experience in our own family lives.
Bad people always prey on those who stand out.
From a gameplay perspective, South of Midnight is rather simple. You're ushered through fairly linear levels that alternate between platforming and combat encounters, with a few journal entries and upgrade points to collect hidden off the beaten path. If you've scaled cliffsides in Uncharted, God of War, or Tomb Raider, its frequent climbing sections will feel pretty familiar. But with the authentic sights and sounds of the American South at the forefront, the detailed environments and beautiful vistas create a strong sense of place.
Almost there.
There isn't really much to figure out per se, as you use Hazel's weaving powers to clear obstacles or zip across the air, but there is an enjoyable momentum as you're funneled from one fight to the next. Combat is contained to distinct arenas across each level, with the idea being that Haints, the demonic manifestations of people's pain and sorrow, plague all of Prospero, and Hazel is the one who can cleanse that corruption. It's a comfortable, if predictable cadence that doesn't really wear thin since it's judicious about when you actually have to fight. This helps South of Midnight not feel repetitive, and I genuinely looked forward to each combat encounter. Similar to the platforming, these fights aren't really pushing any boundaries, but Hazel's attack combos and spells have a certain chunkiness that I really enjoyed. Dodging while cycling through a short list of fun abilities like a stun weave and a grappling strand, while finishing things off with a glory kill-esque finisher, makes the basics satisfying. Paints come in various forms that give encounters enough variety. Some are swift and pesky, while others are hulking beasts. There are a few boss fights to heighten the stakes with a bit of spectacle as well, but they mostly tend to highlight the formulaic nature of combat by relying on derivative versions of mechanics that you've seen elsewhere.
Gotta get to him.
South of Midnight's foundation is perfectly competent, but it's everything else around it that makes it truly stand out, grabbing you with its painterly character designs and striking stop-motion animation style. The unconventional choice helps special moments pop during cutscenes, although it isn't really noticeable in the action. And if you find it too jarring, you can disable the stop-motion effect altogether. Even without it, the details in characters' faces and the superb voice acting feel like the real reward chapter after chapter.
I ain't no boo-hag.
Well, maybe 8.
The specific accents and vernacular come across authentically, to the point where I didn't think twice about them since it all sounded so familiar to me as someone who was born in the region.
Explains why you dress like that.
Whatever.
Southern Gothic folklore hasn't really been explored in games like this, and South of Midnight showcases how rich it is by bringing these tales to life in ways we rarely see. Mythical creatures embody the pain and suffering of townsfolk, melding broader urban myths with the struggles of specific characters throughout the story. Figures like Florida's legendary alligator Two-Toe Tom shows up as a boss, while the shape-shifting Rougarou from Cajun Tales takes a form I hadn't heard of before. And Alabama's Huggin' Molly has a fascinating reinterpretation. It's the sort of amalgamation of folklore that's wonderful to see as someone who is familiar with some of it, but done in a way that's still inviting for the uninitiated. South of Midnight acknowledges the region's real history in subtle and effective ways as well, recognizing that remnants of slavery in the Reconstruction era persist in our modern world, and that trauma can carry across generations. Passing by abandoned houses along the bayou with eviction notices from greedy land grabbers reminds you of the rough and unfair economic conditions many of these communities face. But things like this are woven into its main themes about the complicated dynamics of family, the best and worst parts that can come from our blood relations.
You've grown.
It's been a while.
With her weaving powers, Hazel can peer into the past through visions recreated using the threads that make up the grand tapestry, the flow of all life and memory. From tragic displays of unconditional love to the horrors of the abuse our own kin can inflict on us, South of Midnight focuses on the idea of family being something we either embrace or have to reckon with, and it's told in a way that's inseparable from its setting.
That's why he kept a gun in his office. He didn't mean for it to go off. Probably.
Through it all, Hazel is desperately chasing any possible thread to find her mother after that devastating flood at the start, but is still willing to lend a helping hand to the spirits that have endured in the afterlife. It shows that a little empathy can go a long way.
You'll let him go now, won't you?
So there's a lot I love about the stories in South of Midnight, but I do wish they were told with a little more finesse. The larger plot is missing some necessary connective tissue at times, and it's easy to lose track of why Hazel's journey leads from one thing to another. Characters and narrative threads are sometimes introduced as quickly as they're resolved through story beats that feel a little segmented in ways that aren't entirely clear. There are parts of Hazel's life I'm still wondering about that get brought up as important pieces to the story, and I wish I could have tied those loose ends together before the credits rolled.
You just can't get enough of my hospitality.
I'm sorry. I need to find Hug and Molly.
Do you?
South of Midnight gets the big picture right though, and in its exploration of a region as wide-ranging as the American South, there's an earnest interpretation. While it is also a heavily religious place, the story's more interested in the spirituality that gives rise to these folktales.
Just one question. Why didn't she take you?
And it's not all swamps and basins out there. It's not just Bourbon Street in New Orleans or a politically hostile place for marginalized folks. Those are all a part of it for sure. But I like that we have a story that shows that people live here, and they struggle in ways that are both universal and unique to the region.
This is grown folks' business. You a child. This ain't for you.
It also understands that hurt people, and knows it's not an excuse for the terrible things that pain may drive people to do. It's a bit of a trope in stories that talk about mental health, but there's still a truth to it, and South of Midnight has its own take by focusing on this concept with regards to family.
I'm just trying to find my mama.
Perhaps my favorite touch, however, is how it uses its fantastic soundtrack to tie everything together thematically.
Locals got angry, left traps out for him.
With a mix of bluegrass, blues, jazz, and American folk music that weave in harmonizing choirs, church organs, or banjos and fiddles, it's a showcase of how important music has always been to the region. Big story moments are built up through songs written as if a narrator was walking you through what the characters felt and experienced in their life.
You'll answer for what you do.
Keep your hands away. Hold and crush you is the game she plays.
And they're queued up at just the right time to propel you forward as you're playing. It got me in my feelings at times because there's not much I love more than a fantastic soundtrack used as an effective storytelling device.
He was my brother, Benji his name. He saw things different, he was my shame.
Many folks from the South have a complicated relationship with it. Born in Mississippi and adopting parts of the culture and vernacular as my family and I move throughout the country, it'll always have a special place in my heart. I appreciate having a game that helped me reconnect with those roots in a way that was whimsical and harrowing in equal measure. And that's the sort of value South of Midnight has beyond just being a good action-adventure game. It's worth playing for a little virtual tour of the South you wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Well, nice duds. You been promoted at the Piggly Wiggly?
Oh, hey, Mr. None of the Floods, come to the cottage.
South of Midnight is a straightforward but well-executed action-adventure game on the surface with a simple but satisfying mix of combat and platforming. It's focused, filling out its 12-hour runtime nicely without ever dragging or relying on unnecessary padding. Beyond those basics, however, is a certain heart and artistry that elevates the whole package, inviting you to peer into the deep American South through its folklore, nature, and culture. It might not be the most profound exploration of family life, but it's delivered in ways that feel authentic. From its striking art style to the evocative music that brings big story moments together, Hazel's journey is a captivating one no matter where you're from.
You. You're not what I expected.
Executive Game Reviews editor Tom Marks here with Michael Higham, the reviewer of South of Midnight. Michael, how are you?
Doing okay. I'm hanging in there. It's been a rough week for myself, but I'm excited to talk about this game, man.
Well, you've done a bunch of reviews for us. You are our tech reviews editor, but also you reviewed a lot of RPGs, Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor. You also reviewed action games like Hi-Fi Rush for us back in the day. But we're here to talk about South of Midnight, give people a little bit more behind the scenes on you and your reviewing tastes and why you wanted to review this game specifically. So let's jump into that, because you came to me, you had interest in reviewing South of Midnight. So what drew you to it?
So I played the preview build of this game, and I've been keeping my eye on it in the lead up to release, but after playing it, I realized that there are so many layers to peel back on this one, because it is so representative of Southern culture in the US. And I was born in Mississippi, so I have Southern roots, and I feel like in the review process, you don't just play a game and talk about whether the gameplay is good or not, or if the story hits. You also want to give insight, and specifically, when something is pulling from a part of your life, you kind of want to be the one to review, to peel those layers back and kind of communicate that to other people, whether it be people who share that culture or are on the outside looking in and might be interested in learning about that culture. And I definitely got that out of South of Midnight. And also, just like the Southern folklore is such a rich tapestry of like storytelling in like real life. Granted, like we're talking about like supernatural beings, but the mythical creatures that are told through Southern folklore are so fascinating. And there's like I'm Filipino, by the way, and like so there's a lot of like crossover between a lot of like folklore across the world, but there's a lot of similarities between like what we talk about like growing up with Filipino folklore and then like Southern folklore, where I kind of heard stories about these things as well when I was a kid in the South. So yeah, there's all of that is part of an important part of South of Midnight.
All the stories are real, darling.
Let's talk about the mechanical side of things, the gameplay side of things. What are some other games in this genre, in this style, whatever you want to call it, gameplay-wise, that you really, really liked, that you think, like, man, if someone out there really liked these games, they probably should look into South of Midnight too?
I actually got a lot of familiar feelings playing South of Midnight as I did when I played Bayonetta Origins. The reason why I say that is because both of these games are like very straightforward action-adventure games. They kind of funnel you through these beautiful environments to really give you a sense of place, but it's fairly linear. There's a lot to explore off the beaten path. There's secrets, there's items to collect, but it is a fairly linear path along the way. And it focuses on sort of the way the environment kind of builds this, like I said, a sense of place, and also funnel you through combat arenas. So the pacing feels very familiar. And even the feedback from combat, like the chunky moves that you do, and like when you hit someone with a powerful hit, or you do like a final kill on an enemy, it has like it's felt so similar to that. And I loved Bayonetta Origins, by the way. I don't think that you should go into this thinking you're playing like a platinum action game, like a core Bayonetta or a Devil May Cry necessarily. That's not what this game is. But something that's a little bit lighter on the action adventure is something that you would probably vibe with. Like if you're into that, you will definitely love South of Midnight. It keeps things very simple, but it executes it very well. On the story front, I would suggest an indie game called Norco, which explores modern Southern culture in terms of like how capitalism has affected the region in some really dark ways and how that affects individuals on the ground level. Or something like Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which came out a little while ago, and it's just more of an exploration game, but that explores like Great Depression, Midwest, not exactly focused on the South, but there are similarities through those cultures, especially in pivotal moments in American history. So I also think that is a game that kind of would complement South of Midnight.
And is there anything that didn't make it into your review, some small detail or some little thing that stood out that just wasn't quite time for the review, but you want to shout out now?
Yeah. I mean, I always talk about music in games where the soundtrack is very important. I do so in my review here as well, but I wish I could take a moment in the review and like pull someone aside and play the soundtrack for them, because not only do I think it's good music, like it's again another amalgamation of various influences. You got blues, you have bluegrass, you have American folk music. We have bits and pieces in the video review of that to showcase that a little bit. But when you actually play the game and sit through like these story sequences where you let the music play out and you kind of get to sit with it, that is something that's hard to communicate in text, and I try my best. I always do when I review like an RPG with a great soundtrack, like all the Persona games that I've reviewed. Tom is very familiar with. I love the way this game uses music, and I touch on it, but you gotta see it for yourself. This soundtrack is not just standalone. A great soundtrack from a style of music you don't necessarily hear often in games, but it is also such a strong piece of the storytelling in South of Midnight. So yeah, if you can get your hands on the soundtrack, definitely give it a listen.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for chatting with us about this, for going a little bit deeper into the review about your reviewing tastes, all that sort of stuff. If you want more action games, we've got reviews of The First Berserker Kazan and AI Limit recently, and for all things games, stick with IGN.